I was at a mid-range airport lounge last week waiting for a flight to Zurich and struck up a conversation with a guy who looked like the definition of having it all. Tailored suit, high-end watch, the kind of calm confidence that usually signals a vice president or a successful surgeon. We started talking about the state of the world, and he mentioned he'd just turned 40. When I asked if he was heading home to his family, he gave me this chillingly placid smile. "I've never been married," he said, tapping his phone. "I don't even have dating apps anymore. I deleted them all 6 months ago, and I've never felt more powerful." He wasn't angry or bitter. There was no incel vitriol or shaking of fists at the sky. Instead, he started showing me spreadsheets, actual data sheets he'd compiles on his own market value versus the transactional costs of modern dating. He spoke about women not as people, but as market participants, driven by what he called artificially inflated validation loops from social media. To him, the entire dating world was a rigged stock market, and he was the savvy investor who had just cashed out his chips and walked away from the table. It was a strange, clinical kind of detachment. He told me that his monk mode wasn't a retreat, but a biological strike. He argued that the bottom 80% of men were finally realizing that the ROI on a traditional relationship had gone deeply into the red. Just as he was explaining how AI companions were a more rational asset than a modern wife, our boarding call rang. As he walked away, he dropped one last line. The game didn't break, the players just finally read the source code. That interaction left me stunned. It wasn't just one man's opinion, it felt like a cold, calculated manifesto for a new era. What we are witnessing in 2026 isn't just a loneliness epidemic, it is a systemic liquidity crisis of the digital sexual market. When the rational actor decides the cost of entry is higher than the potential reward, they don't just lose the game, they stop playing entirely.
Wow, that's a profound and honestly a pretty disturbing way to start. I mean, just listening to you tell that, you still seem a little shaken by it.
I am. I'm completely rattled. I spent that whole flight just staring. Because, you hear people complain about dating all the time. Oh, the apps are terrible or can't meet anyone. That's normal.
It's a human.
Exactly. But this was different. This guy, he had spreadsheets. He was using terms like transactional costs and market participants. It was like I was talking to, I don't know, a high-frequency trader analyzing a collapsing stock, not a guy talking about finding a partner. It was so bloodless.
Bloodless is the perfect word. And it actually cuts right to the heart of what we need to do in this deep dive. You said he sounded like a hedge fund manager.
Yes, exactly like one.
Well, that's the lens we need to use today. All the research I've pulled together, and it's from all over behavioral economics, legal theory, evolutionary biology, even welfare state analysis. It doesn't look at this through the lens of romance. It looks at it through the lens of a market.
Which just feels wrong, doesn't it? Love shouldn't be a market.
Well, ideally, no. But in practice, it always has been to some degree. And that phrase he used, that systemic liquidity crisis, is actually a startlingly accurate economic term for what's happening. We're not just talking about a few bad dates. We're talking about a full-blown market failure.
A liquidity crisis.
Yeah.
Okay, so in finance, that's when the cash dries up.
Right.
No one's buying, no one's selling, and the whole system just grinds to a halt.
In a functioning market, you have willing buyers and sellers. In the dating market, you have men and women trying to form partnerships. But what happens when a huge chunk of the buyers, in this case men, look at the price and the product and decide, nope, not worth it?
They walk away from the table, they stop playing.
They exit the market. That's the liquidity crisis. And our mission today is to dig into the why. We're going to apply the rational actor model.
So the core assumption here is that men aren't just being, moody or lazy. We're assuming they're making a cold, hard calculation.
That's the premise, yes. We have to strip away the moralizing, who's good, who's bad, who's toxic, and just look at the raw numbers, the biology, the legal frameworks, the sociology. Because the thesis emerging from all this research is that for a huge and growing number of men, the ROI, the return on investment of a modern relationship, has gone negative.
Wow. Yeah.
And when your ROI is negative, the rational thing to do is stop investing.
Negative ROI on a relationship. It just sounds insane to say that out loud. Mm-hmm. But okay, if we're going to take this seriously, we need to break it down. You said the research points to 3 main drivers here.
3 main pillars, exactly. To really get why this biological strike is happening, we have to look at 3 things. First, there's economic and the legal risk, and that's all about marriage law and assets.
Okay, the money.
Second, the neurobiological trap, the dating apps themselves and what they do to our brains.
The tech.
And third, the sociological shift, specifically how the state has changed its role in the family.
Money, brains, and government. Okay, so let's start with the money. the risk, because that feels like where the rational actor argument is the most solid. I actually came across a story that fits this perfectly. It was in an online forum I follow about this guy named Julian. He's a private equity analyst in London.
Oh, so he lives and breathes this kind of analysis.
He approaches his personal life with the exact same cold, probabilistic rigor he uses for, like, distressed debt. To him, a modern marriage contract isn't about love. He literally calls it a negative convexity risk.
That's a very specific financial term.
And he uses it because he watched his own mentor, a senior partner at his firm, go through a brutal no-fault divorce. This guy had spent 20 years, 60-hour weeks grinding to build an estate, and Julian watched the legal system just strip half of it away. He called it a literal asset stripping that completely ignored 2 decades of work.
So he saw it firsthand.
Yeah. And now Julian says he has completely de-risked his life. He has the nice bachelor pad, he funnels his capital into offshore trusts, and he has a hard rule.
Yeah.
He will not move past casual dating. For him, the ROI is so deep in the red, it's not even a question. Fascinating. But his world sounds so incredibly lonely, you know, like a strategic retreat into a gilded cage.
It might sound lonely to us, but to Julian it sounds safe. And we absolutely have to unpack that term he used, negative convexity risk. That's not just jargon, it's a concept from the bond market, and applying it here is, well, it's a stroke of dark genius.
Okay, I know what convexity is in, like, geometry class. What on earth does it mean for a relationship?
So think of a normal investment. With positive convexity, as things change, your potential for gain grows faster than your potential for loss. Limited downside, theoretically unlimited upside, it's a great bet. Negative convexity is the horror show. It's the exact opposite. It's a situation where your potential downside is massive, and it far, far outweighs any potential upside.
Right. So map that onto a marriage for a guy like Julian.
Well, from his perspective, what's the upside? Companionship, love, children, social status, those are wonderful things, but they're capped. You can't be infinitely happy. There's a ceiling on the emotional return.
The downside.
The downside is uncapped financial Armageddon. If the marriage fails, and let's be honest, the statistics make it pretty close to a coin flip, the loss isn't just emotional, it's a liquidation event. You stand to lose 50% of your net worth, your future earnings could be garnished through alimony, and you could lose primary access to the very assets you were investing in, the children.
So you're risking half of everything you've ever built for a capped return.
In finance, you would be fired on the spot for making a trade like that. It's an indefensible risk profile.
That is. Yeah, that's bleak. But okay, wait a minute. People have been getting married for centuries, rich people especially. Why was it a good bet for them before, if the math is so terrible now?
Because the contract was fundamentally different. This is where one of the sources, Betting the House, is so insightful. It argues that historically, assets weren't the risk in a marriage, they were the insurance.
Insurance. So I think of assets as the prize, not the policy.
Think about it from, say, a 19th century perspective. The contract was a partnership. One partner, traditionally the woman, focused on producing what economists call public goods, raising children, running the household. To do that, she had to sacrifice her own earning potential.
Right. She was out of the labor market.
So the man's assets, his income, that was the insurance policy that protected her investment of time and labor. That's why high asset men were more likely to marry. The contract was strong, it was hard to break, and the assets were the glue that held the whole enterprise together to protect the lineage.
The money was the guarantee.
It was the security for the family line. If you were a wealthy man in 1890, divorce was incredibly rare and almost always required proving fault like adultery or abandonment. You couldn't just wake up one day and decide you wanted half. The contract protected the person who accumulated the assets.
Okay, but we don't live in 1890 anymore.
We absolutely do not. We live in the age of no-fault divorce, and the sources all point to this as the game-changing variable. The moment divorce became unilateral, meaning one person can end the contract for any reason without the other's consent, the entire insurance function of assets got flipped on its head.
So now the assets aren't the glue. They're the jackpot.
They're the incentive. This creates what the sources call contractual asymmetry. Modern marriage, from this cold economic perspective, is a financial instrument with a really perverse incentive structure. If you're the party bringing in the assets, and the law effectively rewards the person who breaks the contract with a massive transfer of those assets.
We pause on that. Rewards the person for breaking. That sounds a little conspiratorial. You're saying the system wants people to divorce.
I'm not saying it wants it, but the incentive structure can lead to that outcome. One text talks about the asset stripping industrial complex. You have an entire industry of lawyers, courts, therapists, all feeding off the liquidation of marital estates. But for a rational actor like Julian, the logic is much simpler.
If he signs the paper, he activates a mechanism that could strip him of his wealth.
And if he doesn't sign the paper, his wealth is secure. It's a simple risk mitigation strategy.
So he can have the girlfriend, the relationship, the life, just not the legal contract.
And the data in the sources back this up. While no-fault divorce laws lowered marriage rates across the board, the drop is steepest among men with significant assets to protect. They're engaging in what the research calls a rational portfolio shift.
That's such a cold term for a life decision, a portfolio shift.
But it's accurate. The male biological strike isn't emotional pouting. It's a calculated reallocation of resources. Men like Julian are moving their capital away from traditional partnership assets, like a family home that's easily divisible in a divorce.
And putting it into rational assets, things the court can't touch.
Offshore trusts, like Julian, or ephemeral things like experiences and travel, or, as we're seeing more and more, digital assets. Even AI companions, which we'll get to. The point is, the ROI calculation has fundamentally changed. For that top tier of men, the risk of loss now massively outweighs the potential benefits of the legal partnership.
You know, what's really terrifying about this isn't Julian. He'll be fine. He's rich. He's insulated. What scares me is how this same cold logic starts to trickle down. Because Julian is opting out because the risk of loss is too high. But there's this whole other massive group of men who are opting out for the opposite reason.
Because the cost of entry is too high.
Exactly. Julian's at the very top of the pyramid. But what about the guys at the bottom? Or what the algorithm tells them is the bottom. I was reading about this young guy in Seoul, Min Jin, a typical salaryman. You know, good job, nice enough guy. He represents that invisible 80% of men who've just stopped. They've given up.
The digital ghost.
He spends his nights not at a bar, but in front of a screen, caught in what neurobiologists are calling a validation dopamine loop.
The trap.
He told a reporter he used to be on the dating apps for hours a day, just swiping, swiping, swiping. But he called it the digital mirror effect. He got 0 matches, nothing. And worse, every time he'd open Instagram, he'd see these high-status influencers, you know, guys with private jets and six-packs, and he said he could feel his own value just plummeting in real time. So now he's in what the research calls a behavioral sink. He gets more of a dopamine hit from leveling up in a video game than from facing the soul-crushing rejection of the actual dating market.
That's absolutely heartbreaking.
And just try to imagine the exhaustion of that, competing against an algorithm that has literally weaponized human desire. It's so easy for us to just label these guys incels or hikikomori and say, oh, they just need to get out more. But when you look at the actual data, you realize they're just responding to the stimulus they're given. These guys aren't failing the system. The system's digital architecture has evolved to make them invisible.
And you're right to feel that empathy, because we need to pull back the curtain on the why. This isn't just Min Jin being sad. He is, in a very real sense, being neurobiologically harvested. One of the sources, Swipe Right for Love, breaks this down perfectly. It compares dating apps to a slot machine.
Okay, I've heard that comparison before, but is it really that direct? Swiping is literally gambling.
It's not a metaphor. It's the identical neurological mechanism. It's called a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. This is old science from B.F. Skinner. If you give a rat a food pellet every single time it presses a lever, the rat only presses it when it's hungry. But if you make the pellet random, maybe it comes on the 5th press, maybe the 100th, the rat becomes an obsessive addict. It will press that lever until it collapses from exhaustion.
Because it's always thinking the next press could be the one.
Exactly. And for men like Min Jin, the win, the match, almost never comes. But the app isn't designed for him to win. It's designed to keep him in that state of anticipation. That's what triggers the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. Your brain doesn't just release dopamine when you get the reward. It releases it in anticipation of the reward, the what if.
So the swipe itself is the drug, not the match.
The swipe is the lever press. The app companies are monetizing his hope, not his success. But there's a second, even darker layer here that you touched on, which the sources call the Fischierian Runaway effect.
Fischierian Runaway. Okay, that sounds like a sci-fi movie title. What is that?
It's a core concept in evolutionary biology. It's the best explanation we have for things like the peacock's tail. So imagine, a long time ago, a few female birds developed a slight preference for males with slightly longer tails.
Okay.
So the males with longer tails got more mates. They passed on the gene for long tails to their sons, and they passed on the preference for long tails to their daughters.
It's a feedback loop.
A runaway feedback loop. The tails get longer and longer and longer until they're absurdly, ridiculously long. They become a genuine handicap. The peacock can barely fly. It's a huge metabolic cost. But the females still prefer it because the signal is, look at me. I'm so genetically fit I can survive despite this insane, useless tail.
Okay, so it's an exaggerated, costly signal. How does that map onto Tinder?
In the digital dating world, what we have is an attention oligopoly. The data in the sources is pretty clear. The top 20% of men are getting something like 80% of the attention. The Fischierian runaway isn't a physical tail, it's what the source calls the digital display premium.
The lifestyle flex. The private jet photo, the yacht party.
Exactly. The trip to Dubai, the rented Lamborghini, the perfect abs. This creates a hypothalamic amplifier. Social media bombards women with a curated 247 highlight reel of these top-tier peacock males.
And our brains, which evolved in small tribes, can't tell the difference. We think this is reality.
The argument is that it functions as a kind of ovulation disruptor. On a subconscious level, the brain is tricked into thinking that these high-status mates are everywhere, that they're abundant. If you can see 50 handsome millionaires in a 10-minute scroll, your brain's standard for an acceptable mate calibrates to that level.
And so the normal guy, the Minjun in the cubicle next to you, who's actually a decent, reliable human being,
he becomes invisible. He's not just average anymore. In that context, he's perceived as defective. He's a sparrow trying to compete in a forest of digital peacocks.
Wow.
And this leads directly to the behavioral sink. This is from John Calhoun's famous Universe 25 mouse experiments from the 70s.
Oh, the mouse utopia that went horribly wrong.
Exactly. He gave them unlimited food and water, but limited space. As the population became incredibly dense, their social structures completely collapsed. Some mice became hyper-aggressive, but many of the males just withdrew. They stopped competing, they stopped mating, and they just sat in a corner and groomed themselves. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones.
My God. That's Min Jin.
Oh.
He's a beautiful one. He's just grooming himself with video games.
He's engaging in what the source calls digital seclusion. For a rational actor in that bottom 80%, the cost of faking the lifestyle of creating that digital display premium is impossibly high. He knows he can't win the game. So the only rational move is to stop playing.
And that's where the AI companions fit in. The source called it a decentralized protest, which is a fascinating frame because usually we just mock that, right? Oh, look at the loser with the AI girlfriend.
Yeah.
It's a punchline.
But this research reframes it as a rational market substitution. If the transaction cost of pursuing a real relationship is constant rejection, emotional turmoil, and financial outlay for dates that go nowhere, and the AI offers guaranteed validation, zero rejection, and low cost,
The AI becomes the rational asset. Again, it's the efficient choice.
it's another form of the biological strike, just enabled by technology. It provides the simulation of intimacy without any of the negative convexity risk we talked about earlier.
So if we step back and look at the map,
Yeah.
we've got the top tier guys like Julian checking out because the legal risks are too high. We've got the bottom tier guys, the Minjuns, checking out because the algorithmic game is rigged. But that leaves this huge group of men in the middle, the working class guys, the men who for generations were the absolute backbone of the family.
The men who built everything.
Right. And their story, I think, is the most politically charged of all. There's this narrative from the American Rust Belt about a woman, Sarah, and the father of her child, Marcus. It's presented as a textbook example of what the sources are calling state-sponsored hypergamy. So Marcus has a tough job, construction. It's grueling, the income fluctuates. Sarah found that because of the way welfare, child support, and family court subsidies are structured, she was actually more financially stable as a single mother, supported by the state, than she would be as a wife tied to Marcus's unsteady income.
The perverse math of the safety net.
Exactly. The state, in effect, became the better, more reliable provider, the alpha. And Marcus, he just sort of drifted away. His role was made obsolete by a government check. And I've seen documentaries with men like him. They feel like ghosts in their own communities. They're biological strikers who have no stake left in the reproductive game. And look, I want to be really clear. I believe in a social safety net. But we have to ask the hard question. Have we accidentally created a system that subsidizes the dissolution of the family?
That is the ultimate unintended consequence. And the concept you mentioned, state-sponsored hypergamy, is the key.
So we talked about hypergamy as marrying up. How does the state play a role in that?
Historically, a woman's survival and her children's survival depended on marrying a man with resources. A good husband was a long-term survival strategy, but the source material, particularly the texts on gender and welfare state changes, argues that the modern state has usurped that primary role of the male provider.
So the government is the new husband.
In a cold economic sense, yes. The state provides the long-term provision signal that women evolved to seek in a mate: shelter, food security, healthcare. And the state is a much more reliable provider than Marcus the construction worker. The U.S. Treasury never gets laid off or injured on the job.
So if the state is guaranteeing survival, how does that change a woman's mate selection strategy?
It allows it to shift. She no longer needs to prioritize the boring but reliable provider, the Marcus. She is now free to prioritize what the sources call short-term genetic quality.
The spark. The chemistry, the attractive bad boy.
Exactly. She can have a child with the man she finds most attractive, even if he has no resources or intention of sticking around, because the state underwrites the long-term cost. The average hard-working guy like Marcus simply can't compete with the financial security of the state.
But surely that's a net good for the woman, right? She gets freedom and security.
In the short term, you could argue that, but the rational actor analysis forces us to ask, what then happens to Marcus? This connects directly to the shift from the male breadwinner model to the adult worker model that the sources describe.
Explain that difference.
The male breadwinner model, for all its flaws, and it had many, gave the average man a clear and vital purpose. He was the provider. That was his path to status, to family, to respect. It was his function.
And the adult worker model.
That model views society as just a collection of individual economic units. The state's goal is simply to have every adult in the workforce. Men and women are just interchangeable cogs. But the 2026 Revelation source argues that this model willfully ignores the biological reality of reproduction and child-rearing.
Because raising a child isn't just another job.
No. And when you remove the economic necessity of a father from the family unit, you get what the sources call social fragmentation. Men like Marcus become ghosts. If they aren't needed as providers, and they aren't in the top 20% genetically to be chosen as short-term mates, what is their function? What is their stake in the future of the community?
I've seen that in struggling towns. The men just exist. They work enough for rent and video games. There's no ambition, no drive to build anything. Because, for who? For what?
The market, both the sexual market and the state-subsidized economic market, has signaled to them that their role is redundant. And this is the direct pipeline to the demographic collapse we're seeing.
The fertility rates, they're cratering everywhere. Japan, South Korea, all over Europe, here in the U.S.
It's the final invoice for this entire liquidity crisis. When you disincentivize long-term, stable partnerships, you get fewer families. And fewer families mean fewer children. We've effectively made the traditional family the most expensive and riskiest lifestyle choice available.
It's such a strange paradox. We build all these systems to help people and give them freedom. But in doing so, we may have severed the very bonds that held society together. We tried to liberate everyone, and we might have just ended up isolating everyone.
And when you stack all three factors together, Julian's legal risk at the top, Minjin's algorithmic exclusion at the bottom, and Marcus's functional obsolescence in the middle, it's not just one problem. It's a total systemic failure, a perfect storm.
So where does that leave us? A lot of men are checking out. Is this just a temporary phase? Is it a pendulum that's going to swing back on its own? Or is this just the new reality?
The sources are pretty clear that they view this as a permanent systemic shift. They call it an evolutionary mismatch. We're running Stone Age software, our brains on bizarre alien hardware, a world of complex legal codes, digital algorithms, and massive state bureaucracies. We're not built for this environment.
And so the rational response is to just unplug.
Exactly. The 2026 Revelation text brings up this final idea of stoic indifference, or monk mode.
I see monk mode all over the internet, but it's usually some fitness influencer trying to sell you a workout plan.
That's the commercialized, superficial version. But in this context, it's something much deeper. It's about a demoralization of existence.
Demoralization, as in taking the morality out of the equation.
It's not about being immoral or amoral in a negative sense. It's about rejecting the societal imperative to participate. It's not about anger at women or hating society. It's a calm acceptance of the market conditions and a strategic pivot.
So instead of trying to fight a game that feels rigged, you just build your own game.
You do. The core argument is that for these men, solitude is no longer a punishment. It has become a strategic asset. By withdrawing from a system where they perceive the rules guarantee a loss, they're exercising what one source calls rational sovereignty.
Rational sovereignty. I like
Yeah.
that term. It implies agency, control. They're not just giving up, they're reallocating their own resources, their time, their money, their focus into things they can control.
Their career, their hobbies, their fitness, their investments, it's a withdrawal of energy from the collective reproductive project. And that ultimately is why it's a societal crisis. A society can't function long-term if a huge portion of its members withdraw their consent to participate.
It's an incredibly sobering picture. We're so used to talking about dating and marriage as matters of the heart. But when you strip it all down and look at it through this lens of liquidity and convexity and dopamine loops, it starts to look a lot less like a romance and a lot more like a devastating market crash.
And just like any market crash, you can't shame or moralize the investors into coming back. You have to fundamentally fix the structural incentives that cause them to flee in the first place.
Which brings us to the end of this deep dive. We've covered a staggering amount of ground, from the high finance world of Julian, to the digital isolation of Minjun, to the sociological displacement of Marcus. And I want to leave you with one final thought from the source material that has really stuck with me. Nature is amoral. It does not grade on effort, only on function. If our current social, legal, and digital architecture has made the traditional male role functionally obsolete or financially toxic for a majority of men, we shouldn't be shocked when they simply log off. The question we're left with isn't how do we fix the men, but whether a society can actually survive when 80% of its players decide to walk away from the table.
That is the question.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next deep dive.